everyone, welcome, and I hope you'll enjoy the discussion. I'm Tom van der Hoven, International Development Consultant for IIMC. I have Peter Sass with me, and we'll be talking about hybrid meetings and the challenges that poses to clerks and democratic officers. Welcome, Peter, and thanks for agreeing to share your views with us today. Please tell us a bit about yourself.
Well, good afternoon, Tom. I'm the head of governance for the combined team serving Richmond and Wandsworth councils in southwest London. So effectively, I head up a shared services team supporting those two sovereign councils. And together, the two councils serve more than 500,000 Londoners. I'm also Vice Chair of the Association of Democratic Services Officers, or ADSO for short.
Thanks, Peter. Interesting having two councils. That must be quite a challenge working with two different councils.
It is a challenge. So Wandsworth has 60 council members. Richmond has 54, so that's 114 councillors in total. And at the moment, Tom, both councils have different governance systems and both have different political administrations. So it is quite a challenge to serve each council with those differences.
I can imagine. Just out of interest, Peter, do you have different teams or do you have one team servicing both?
I have a single team servicing both. Right. Half of my team is located in Wandsworth. The other half of the team is located in Richmond, in Twickenham, actually, where the civic offices are. And I think for most of my team members, they would support meetings in the respective authority. It's only really myself and my deputy who would support meetings in both councils and have regular contact with councillors in both authorities.
Right. Okay. Well, very interesting. Councils have been hosting their virtual meetings during the pandemic, and I can imagine that when we come out of this, people will want to meet face to face again. Although there's been some advantages in having virtual meetings. What's been your experience?
Well, I think virtual meetings have, as you say, been very successful. They were thrust upon us, as you know, last April, and we had the legislation in place quite quickly following lockdown to do that. But I think you're right. I think council members are missing the sort of cut and thrust, if I can put it like that, of face-to-face meetings. I think local democracy is very much an in-person process, and I think council members want to get back to physical meetings. Having said that, I'd like to think that my council members in both of the authorities that I serve can see the benefits of working in a virtual or a hybrid way in terms of savings in travel time, the positive impact of that on the environment, flexibility for participants, easier for colleagues who might be shielded or self-isolating to still participate in meetings, and obviously more convenient for the public, as well as increasing transparency in the decision-making process. So at Wandsworth, one of my councils did not, as a matter of course, stream any of its formal meetings to the internet before the pandemic came along. So that was a new requirement of Wandsworth, and all of its formal meetings in the last year have had to be streamed because of the legislation. And I think that's increased the transparency of the decision-making process. I also think that possibly member behaviour has been slightly better in a virtual world. I mean, it's very difficult in a face-to-face meeting where more than one person talks across each other. That's even harder in a virtual world. Yeah, and I do accept the point that some people think that virtual meetings are too stage managed, too stilted. But on the other hand, it does mean that when a councillor is speaking, everyone else listens and they can get their points across in an ordered way. I also think that for some newer councillors, if they were in a physical meeting, they might, I suppose, feel slightly nervous about contributing in a large council meeting, particularly if they're brand new. They might, for instance, be wary of being heckled from the other side. The sort of the eye rolling and heckling that you sometimes get in a feisty council meeting.
Yeah.
When you're in the comfort of your own home, participating in a virtual or a hybrid meeting, I'm wondering whether some of those newer council members have found it easier and more comfortable to participate. So I certainly think there are a whole range of benefits to having virtual or hybrid meetings.
That's very interesting. And I can see what you say, that somebody, a newer councillor, would find it a bit more comforting when he's at home rather than amongst all these new faces around him, and people feel self-conscious of contributing. I would imagine that people may want the choice in future of how they actually attend meetings, whether they do it virtually or they turn up in person. What's your view of what constitutes a hybrid meeting?
Well, certainly dealing with your first point, first of all, Tom, if that's okay, I do agree that that the local authorities having permanent flexibility going forward is key. I think councils up and down the country have realised that for certain types of meetings, possibly not all, but for certain types of meetings, that operating in a virtual or a hybrid way is actually better for the reasons that we've already talked about. Having said that, I know that many of my council members are champing at the bit to get back into the council chamber to debate policies with their political opponents and to have physical face-to-face meetings. So I don't think virtual or hybrid meetings is a panacea for all meetings, but I think it's right that local authorities should have the choice to choose which of their meetings will be face-to-face going forward and which will be either virtual or hybrid. In terms of my view about what constitutes a hybrid meeting, I'm conscious there are different definitions. So mine would be where a meeting has both a physical place and a virtual place or places, and where all participants, including members of the public, can choose equally and equitably how they participate in that meeting, either by visiting the physical place or by joining remotely. But I also think, and I think this is an important point, Tom, that there must be what I would call parity of involvement for all of those participants, whether they're joining from a virtual place or a physical place. And what I mean by that is that it can't be more difficult to participate from a virtual place than it is from a physical place. In other words, it can't be more difficult to indicate to speak. It can't be more difficult to be seen and heard by everyone else in the meeting, and it can't be more difficult to participate and vote and interject and debate with political colleagues. I think in terms of hybrid meetings, we also have to bear in mind, of course, Tom, that the person chairing that meeting might themselves not be in the physical place. Yeah. That they might choose for whatever reason to chair the meeting from a virtual place. So supporting a chair virtually when possibly most of the other participants are in the physical place would be a huge challenge, I think. But that's my definition of what constitutes a hybrid meeting.
Yeah, interesting. I would imagine that that's the ideal situation. I think the challenge is going to be for your colleagues is what will fit with your council. What can they afford? What fits in with what their aspirations are? And I suppose at the end of the day, we're going to see a a mix of how people apply it, depending on their own situation.
Yes, exactly. And I think it will also be different for those authorities that are geographically smaller compared to, say, a large county that might be 40, 50, 60 miles across, compared to a small borough or a district that's only, that geographically is very small. So I think that highlights our earlier point, doesn't it, Tom, that going forward, flexibility for councils is the most important thing to determine the most appropriate arrangements for themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. In some of the discussions I've had with colleagues and some in America, you get some areas where the legislation is very specific. This is what you will do, and there's no choice about it. So I think it's key, which sort of brings me to the next point, which is about the future. And we're aware that current legislation doesn't necessarily allow these meetings in future, but you are in consultation with government, aren't you, to try and make sure that they come up with the right solution?
Well, the legislation point for me is a really interesting one, Tom. So in England, 5 years ago, actually, in 2016, the government issued a consultation paper called Connecting Town Halls. I don't know if you recall that consultation paper, but it sought to obtain views from the local government sector about whether or not certain types of local authority meetings could be held by video conferencing. They were talking at the time about combined authority meetings and joint committee meetings, and they argued in their consultation paper that there was a case for these meetings to be undertaken by video conferencing because of traveling distances for some of the participants, the saving on expenses for traveling to and from those meetings, and perhaps better engagement, which is interesting given that those are some of the arguments that we're using now for the legislation going forward for virtual and hybrid meetings. So I think that that's evidence that certainly the government at the time was interested in at least having a conversation with local government and the wider sector about what constitutes a meeting place and what constitutes meeting attendance. So I think that's quite an interesting background.
Yeah.
Fast forward to 2020, I don't think that I would be alone, Tom, in thinking that the physical meetings that we are used to would have resumed well before the sunset clause in the current legislation. I certainly don't mind admitting that when I looked at those regulations that were published in April 2020, I thought we would be able to resume physical meetings a long way before May of 2021. So I didn't think that the sunset clause would come into play. And yet, unfortunately, because of the way that the virus has progressed and the intensity of that virus and all of the variants, etc., as things currently stand, local authorities in England will no longer have the power to hold virtual or hybrid meetings beyond the 7th of May this year. And as you quite rightly say, a number of councils and certainly our professional associations, so ADSO and also Lawyers in Local Government, LLG, have been working very hard with the government over the last few weeks and months to try and move this forward. I think the conversation with government has been very constructive, and that we eagerly await the government's response.
Interesting. I think you sort of touched on your members' view about the future. Do you think both councils will want to return to face-to-face meetings with some virtual meetings in between, or have you had that discussion with them?
I think it's going to be different slightly, I think, across the two councils. Richmond and Wandsworth are quite different. The cultures and the organisational structures and the governance systems are quite different. I can certainly see most if not all, formal council meetings and committee meetings being physical, in-person, face-to-face meetings as soon as practically possible, as soon as safe to do so. I would like to think that the conversation with council members in those two councils about having some meetings being held in a virtual or hybrid way could proceed into the future. Certainly informal meetings taking place in that way, perhaps not formal public meetings. But I'd like to think that the council members and my officer colleagues in the councils have seen the benefits of running virtual and hybrid meetings in terms of time saving, etc., etc., etc. So let's hope that they continue in some form.
Yeah, I'm sure. What arrangements have you got in place currently for virtual or hybrid meetings?
Yeah. So let me start with Wandsworth first of all, if I may, because pre-pandemic, Wandsworth, as I think I said earlier on, didn't stream any of its meetings live to the internet. So when the regulations came along in April of 2020, that necessarily meant more change for Wandsworth and more investment, which I'll come on to later, and new working practices. For Richmond, Richmond had been webcasting most of its formal meetings for many years, and therefore the streaming element of the regulations, was no different. Was no different to them. For virtual meetings, we've been using the Microsoft Teams platform for video conferencing, connected to a webcasting system, a public eye webcasting system, and that system has been in place for both councils. We've also invested in both councils in hybrid meeting technology, with sort of a camera system that's activated by microphones. So when a councillor in the physical place presses their microphone to speak, the camera would automatically whiz to their image, and it's all linked up to a Teams meeting and webcast in the normal way. Unfortunately, because of the most recent lockdown, the one that we're currently in, the opportunity for testing that hybrid functionality was very limited. We ran a couple of sort of internal test events, but we haven't as yet run any hybrid public meetings, but we're looking forward to doing so.
Right, interesting, and we'll touch on technology a bit later on again. But it's interesting, having spoken to people, the range of arrangements that people have made. Yours is obviously very sophisticated with your webcasting and integrated systems, but others do it in a much more, how can I put it, a simple way, and they'll have a camera and a microphone, and they manage it because they've got a smaller setup. And I think that's what people need to accept. Not everybody has to go down the very expensive way of integrated. It's really what suits them, which will determine what they will put in.
That's right, Tom, and I do feel for those smaller councils, including parish and town councils, all of whom are trying to cope with virtual meetings, some of whom having tiny budgets and yet still having to comply with the same legislation that two large unitary councils in London are complying with. So I do accept that for many councils, investing in an all singing, all dancing system is just not possible. Yeah.
Just talking about some of the things that will be required, meeting facilities, for instance. Can you accommodate all of your members in one meeting? If it's a hybrid meeting, do they have the choice, or will they have the choice? And the same with members of the public. Will you have to limit numbers, I would imagine? I don't know what your council meeting facilities are like.
So in both councils, we have we have a variety of different sized meeting rooms, and of course a council chamber in each location. So I think for most committee meetings and subcommittee meetings, we've got rooms that are large enough for members, council members, to attend physically and to socially distance. And obviously we've got, you know, risk assessments in place and screens and separate entrance and exits and hand sanitizing, etc. I think that the struggle we will have is when it comes to what you and I would know to be a full council meeting, where all of the members are required, summoned to come along. We would struggle in both councils to accommodate a full council meeting with social distancing, and with public gallery facilities. So in terms of the councillors, we would have to, you know, if the legislation allowed, we might have to go down the hybrid route. But if the legislation expires on the 7th of May and isn't renewed, and there's nothing further in place, and therefore we would have to revert to physical meetings, then we might have to look at potentially hiring another facility, either a council-owned facility or perhaps another venue to hold a socially distanced council meeting. And you're right, we would probably also have to restrict the size of any public galleries that would be associated with those meetings. So it will be quite a big challenge, I think.
Yeah, interesting times ahead, isn't it? Technology, sorry?
Certainly is, Tom.
Yeah. So Peter, just thinking of technology, and I know you've picked up on and mentioned a couple of things, but if we can just have a quick look through that again, screens, audio, visual, and then specifically on the sound system and voting system and webcasting, if you can just tell us a bit about that.
Yes, of course. So in terms of the basic system for both virtual and hybrid meetings, we are a Microsoft organization, so we're using the Microsoft suite of products. So the video conferencing element is Microsoft Teams. And for both councils, we are using the Public Eye webcasting solution to connect the Teams meeting and to produce the webcast output. Okay. We have, in terms of audio visual, you know, we're using a combination of fixed screens for those hybrid meetings that we intend to have, and some movable screens and other equipment as well. We are planning on the basis that when we're allowed, all of the physical attendees at the meeting place would need their own device. So when we carried out a hybrid meeting test just before Christmas, just before the current lockdown that we're in, I deliberately asked the participants in the physical place, some to have their devices in front of them connected to the Teams meetings, and others not to, just to see what their experience was like. And for those participants who didn't use their own device, they couldn't see as easily. For instance, when one of the virtual participants raised their hand or put a comment in the chat, they couldn't see that very clearly because it was on a big screen at the front of the room. And when one of the virtual participants shared their screen and did a presentation, again, some of the participants in the physical place couldn't see that presentation very well on the screens at the front of the room. So I think going forward for hybrid meetings, I would say to all participants in the physical place to bring a device, either a laptop or a tablet, so that they could see the presentations, etc., taking place in the hybrid meetings. We
Very
have
interesting.
a camera system that's activated by the microphones in both councils, so we don't need a camera operator. So when one of the participants presses their microphones in the physical place, a camera will automatically spin round to capture their image.
Okay.
So that's quite helpful in terms of trying to run a hybrid meeting. And I think we'll get on to resources for running these hybrid meetings slightly later on. In terms of voting systems, if I could touch on that, Tom, we trialed a number of different ways of voting across the two councils, and sometimes that differs from different types of meetings. So we've tried everyone on screen with a physical hand up like this.
Yeah.
We tried the hands up facility in the Teams meetings. We've done roll calls, obviously, what you and I would probably know as a recorded vote, where the chair reads out all of the names of the participants and asks for them to indicate whether they're voting for or against or abstaining. So we tried a number of different systems, and I think going forward for hybrid meetings, I think all of those features will work relatively well for voting. We've also given...
Peter, sorry, can I just ask, when it's a hybrid meeting, you've got members of the public either in attendance or virtual, members either in attendance or virtual. If you have a voting system, online voting system, how would people, members of the public that are not logged into your team system, how would they see how members are voting?
So on that, Tom, we would be very clear that the chair would have to announce that vote to make sure that anyone watching the stream could work out what has happened. And I think that's another point. Since we've gone live with virtual meetings, for every formal meeting we produce a sort of a chair's briefing note or aide memoir, or different councils call these things by different names, but under each of the items we make it very clear that at the end of the voting on a particular item that the chair should confirm whether the relevant motion has been agreed or not, and what the voting was, to make sure that members of the public watching that stream can tell what happened.
Interesting. Webcasting, how do you webcast? Is it part of the system? How does the webcasting work?
That's right. So the Teams meeting is connected to a webcasting system, and one of my staff will attend every formal meeting and be responsible for the webcasting element, and to make sure that that's feeding through properly to the internet. You know, we've had a couple of technical glitches in the last year where we found, unfortunately, that the meetings weren't being streamed properly. And in most of those cases, we've had to ask the chair of that meeting to pause the meeting while we reboot the system and start streaming again. Fortunately, we've only had one meeting in the last year that unfortunately we had to completely abandon because we just weren't able to get the stream running, and it was an important cabinet meeting with decisions being made. So we had to adjourn that meeting for a few days to enable that to be fixed.
Yeah, interesting. Quite a challenge, which sort of leads me to staffing. You know, and I say the old days before COVID, I would imagine you only needed one person in a meeting or two people at maximum. What's the impact been on staffing?
That's a good question, and you're right. Pre-pandemic, I would normally only send one of my team to each formal meeting. For a full council meeting, I might need a couple of other colleagues helping out. But you're right. Typically, it would be one member of staff only per formal meeting. For virtual meetings in the last year, I've had 2 or 3 members of staff supporting most meetings. So you'd have a clerk in the traditional sense of the word that you and I understand.
Yeah.
You'd have another person doing the webcasting, and then a third person doing what we call a technical clerk role. So they would be concerned with making sure that everyone remained connected during that meeting, and contacting any participants who lost connection and advising us of that, so that we could advise the chair, uploading presentations, etc. during the meeting. And obviously on the connection point, that's particularly important for committees like the planning committee, where, as you know, Tom, from your experience, if a member missed a crucial part of the debate on a planning application, then he or she might not be able to vote on that application. So maintaining connections is very important, and we found that we needed to monitor that to make sure that the applications were considered and voted on in the most appropriate way. So you're absolutely right. The resources required to support virtual meetings has been fairly significant.
Yeah. Peter, I think you've touched on costs previously, but just to catch up on that again, because I think that's one of the main concerns for small councils is, do I have to spend a lot of money to do this? Or did it cost you a lot? Although you said you had some of the technology was already installed in any case, wasn't it?
That's right. So I think the costs for running virtual meetings in Richmond were minimal, I would say. I think we needed an additional laptop to do the webcasting and some cabling and other costs. So de minimis cost, I would say, on the Richmond side. Wandsworth didn't, as I've said, webcast its meetings before the pandemic. So Wandsworth had to pay for that to happen. So we've spent in the last 12 months, we've spent in the region of £8,000 in Wandsworth to webcast, for the webcasting element of those meetings. And certainly going forward for hybrid meetings, that's necessitated an investment in technology to run those hybrid meetings of, I would say, between £6,000 and £8,000 per council to invest in that hybrid technology.
Okay.
Yeah.
Members of the public that want to speak, how do they register with you in advance if they want to speak, and if they are not physically present, how do they log into the same Teams system as you do?
Yes, that's right. They all have to register in advance. We don't have any meetings where the public can just participate without notice.
Right.
Some councils do, I think, but neither Wandsworth or Richmond does. Yes, they would need to have the same login to the Teams meeting that other participants do, and we invite them to join the lobby until we're ready for them to participate, until their slot arrives, and then at the end of their contribution, we ask them to leave if they don't leave themselves. And actually, the vast majority have respected that, Tom, and haven't attempted to either remain in the meeting and rejoin. I know that some councils have had, some isolated problems with members of the public trying to disrupt meetings, but we haven't seen that in Wandsworth and Richmond.
Okay. Setting up, I'm just jumping ahead a bit, but setting up your meetings, is it time consuming to set it up, or is most of your equipment is permanently set up in those rooms?
Yes, we've allocated space to set the laptops and the cabling up, and we leave it set up from meeting to meeting. So it doesn't take too long to get ready for a new meeting because all of the connections are there. But we always test the system before we go live.
Okay. Member training and chairman, I suppose it's quite important for the chairman or whoever chairs the meeting to be briefed properly, perhaps have an 8 memoir. Is that something you do?
Very much so. And at the beginning of the pandemic, obviously we weren't able to train our members face to face for virtual meetings. And many of our councillors had not used video conferencing before. We were able to write some quite comprehensive user guides, including screenshots of where to click on the screen to join a virtual meeting. And we tried wherever possible to run some sort of test events for our committees before the night of the actual meeting. The vast majority of council members were terrific and picked up the new technology extremely well. A handful of council members we provided one-to-one support for, remotely of course, either over the telephone or by doing a test Teams meeting on a one-to-one basis with them. So yes, we supported our members as much as we possibly could. And you're right, for all of the formal meetings that we run, there'd be a chair's briefing note or aide memoir, which sets out all of the committee items, any known public speakers that we're aware of, so that they can run the virtual meetings. And I feel for the chairs, Tom, as you know, when you're running a physical meeting, you'll have your senior officers and your advisors quite near you, and it's quite easy to lean across and whisper in the chair's ear or pass them a note if you want them to say something. That's impossible in a virtual world. Many of our meeting chairs are in their own homes, and we're in our homes trying to run a virtual meeting. So some committees have developed sort of little WhatsApp groups, and we sometimes text each other and text councillors and text the chairs during the virtual meetings alongside the briefing note that's already there. So I think most councils have developed their own ways of managing this.
Would you, what I'll do is when I publish the recording of our chat, would you be okay if I published contact details for you as well? And if anybody was interested to see what you've done, would you be prepared to share it with them?
Yes, of course, Tom, I'll be delighted.
Yeah, that's great. Just one last question, Peter. Can members join by telephone, or do they have to log into the team system?
No, they can join by telephone, and in fact, we've had a handful of instances where members have been unable to join the video conference and have joined by mobile phone, as have some members of the public done so on occasion. So yes, it's something that we can easily handle. When they call in, do you have a separate phone that they dial into? They don't dial into the system itself. They dial to a separate mobile phone, perhaps, or a landline? I think a bit of both. I think they can dial into the system. They can dial into the team meeting from a mobile phone, and as long as we know who that is, then we'll admit them to the meeting.
Yeah. Interesting. Peter, I think that sort of covers all the questions I had. Have you got anything you still want to add, perhaps, at this stage?
I think we've covered most of the issues, Tom. I think for English local authorities, we're all waiting with bated breath to see what the government's going to do about the virtual meetings legislation. So here we are. It's the 12th of March. May is going to be here just quickly.
Yeah.
So I think we all just want the certainty of knowing what's happening with that legislation. And I very much hope that the positive and professional and constructive discussions that ANSO and others are having with government will continue, and that there's a positive outcome. And I'm very hopeful of that.
Yeah. Well, let's hope they get it sorted. Well, that brings us to the end of our discussion, Peter. Thank you very much for sharing your views with us today. Really appreciate that, and I'm sure that our members will find that very helpful. Thank you very much.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Tom. Good to see you.
Good to see you too. To anyone out there, if you have any views or comments on today's discussion, then please email me at imeet@iimc.com. I repeat, imeet@iimc.com. Thank you for joining us. Goodbye and stay safe.